At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's GeneralG. Let's begin. Cadet Vig couldn't believe his ears when the General himself stepped onto the main stage of the Interspecies Academy, offering a challenge and promising something unimaginable. Today is a special day. I'm not here just to offer you a challenge, but also to reward each of you who manages to overcome your chosen trainer. The reward is immediate promotion. No more training, no more hardship. You'll receive a raise and a good position within the Galactic Army. Now, choose which Deathworlder trainer you want for your challenge. Every pair of eyes, every visual appendage, every sensory organ capable of perceiving light turned in perfect synchronization toward the direction the General's primary manipulator indicated. Vig's own reptilian eyes, with their horizontal pupils and excellent color perception, locked onto the stage where three figures stood in strong contrast to one another. His scaled eyelids blinked twice in quick succession, an involuntary response to what he was seeing. The first trainer was impossible to mistake. A Neric. By the ancestors, an actual Neric stood there on the platform, and Vig felt his blood run cold, despite the warmth of the crowded assembly hall. The creature was everything the stories had promised, and worse. Its skin was thick and red, its hands ended in curved claws, and even its feet bore similar armaments. A massive tail swayed beneath it, and Vig could see the bone protrusion at its tip, a natural club capable of shattering skulls. And there, centered on its forehead like some obscene crown, was a sharp horn that seemed to be there just to prove this creature had more natural weapons than any reasonable life form would ever need. Vig felt a laugh bubble up inside his chest, though he dared not let it escape his throat. The absurdity of it all was almost too much to process. Who in their right mind would choose to fight a Neric? The very concept was ludicrous, suicidal even. He glanced down at his own body, at his scaled green skin that had always seemed so tough, so protective back on his homeworld. His claws, which he had once thought sharp and dangerous, suddenly seemed like the blunt tools of a herbivore compared to the Neric's weaponry. He was nothing more than a green lizard, prey for that red predator, and the matchup would be absurd from the first moment. The Neric would tear him apart before he could even think of mounting a defense. No. Whoever chose that option was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, and Vig had no intention of finding out which category he fell into. His eyes continued their survey, moving to the second option. What he saw next made the Neric seem almost merciful by comparison. The second trainer was a Zevol, and just looking at it sent a deep visceral pain shooting through Vig's nervous system, as if his body was remembering wounds it had never actually received. The creature's entire body was a sea of sharp needles, thousands upon thousands of them. The needles covered every visible surface, creating a defense so complete that Vig couldn't imagine how anyone could possibly land a blow without impaling themselves in the process. A being whom a certain species out there would find a resemblance to an animal called a porcupine, though Vig had no reference for such a creature. All he knew was that the Zevol represented pain incarnate, a being designed by the universe to punish anyone foolish enough to touch it. Who in their right mind would choose to fight that? The same thought echoed through Vig's mind again, this time with even more conviction than before. At least with the Neric, death might be quick if you were lucky. With the Zevol, every moment of combat would be agony, every brush against those needles a lesson in suffering. He shook his head, and let out a soft sigh that was lost in the murmuring of the crowd around him. Then his eyes settled on the third option, the final trainer standing on the platform, and Vig felt his confusion deepen. This being, he didn't immediately recognize its species, which was unusual given his extensive studies in xenobiology. The figure was almost certainly male, based on the body structure and stance, though Vig acknowledged his assumptions might be incorrect when dealing with unknown species. Fur covered the top of the being's head, dark and somewhat unruly, but the rest of the visible skin appeared remarkably soft, almost delicate. The coloration was somewhere between tan and pink, nothing like the tough hides or scales or exoskeletons that Vig associated with dangerous predators. Could this be real? Was this truly one of the Death World trainers the General had spoken of? Vig felt a flutter of hope in his chest, a dangerous emotion that he tried to suppress even as it grew stronger. Perhaps there had been a mistake. Perhaps this third being was not a trainer at all, but an assistant, or maybe a representative from a diplomatic species who happened to be visiting. Surely, the General would not place someone so apparently defenseless alongside monsters like the Nirik and the Zevol. It was not only Vig who noticed this discrepancy. The realization seemed to spread throughout the crowd of cadets like electricity through a conductor. A collective understanding that passed from one being to another without words. The murmuring grew louder, more excited, and then, in a moment that would have been almost beautiful if it weren't so desperate, the entire assembly moved in absolute unison. Hundreds of cadets from dozens of species all surged forward as one toward the third trainer. Vig found himself caught in the surge, his own legs moving before his mind fully processed the decision. But he was clever enough, even in the chaos, to position himself strategically. He didn't fight his way to the very front of the rapidly forming line, where the most aggressive and confident cadets were already jostling for position. Those fools would be the first to test the trainer, to discover whatever hidden dangers might lurk beneath that soft exterior. No, Vig wouldn't be a pioneer today, but neither did he want to end up at the back of what was quickly becoming an enormous queue, where he might have to wait for hours for his chance, possibly only to be told that the day's challenges were over before he could even attempt his own. Instead, Vig worked his way into a comfortable spot in the middle of the line. It was perfect. He would have time to observe, to learn from those who went before him, to identify weaknesses and develop a strategy. And yet, he wouldn't have to wait so long that exhaustion or boredom might dull his edge. Now that he was closer, Vig could make out more details. The third trainer's chest bore a tag, something he hadn't been able to see from his previous position in the crowd. The letters were in standard galactic script, and his neural translator implant processed the information. Human, the tag read. Species, human. Origin, Earth. The name meant nothing to Vig. He searched his memory for any reference to humans or Earth and came up empty. A newly discovered species, perhaps? A sound from the stage drew Vig's attention away from the human. The General was laughing. The numerous, powerful tentacles that extended from the General's chin moved chaotically as he spoke, writhing with what Vig recognized as amusement in the General's species. "I see that you all made your choice," the General announced. There was some irony in his tone, but was subtle enough that many of the cadets probably missed it entirely, too focused on their own excitement and plans to notice anything. The General continued, his tentacles still swaying. "Let me tell you about your human friend here. This species comes from a high-gravity planet called Earth, that recently joined the Galactic Federation. Earth is classified as a death world, home to some of the fiercest creatures ever recorded into the galactic database. Beings of deadly poison that can drop a creature 10 times their size with a single bite. Sharp claws that can tear through flesh and bone. Fangs that deliver toxins capable of shutting down neural systems in seconds. Beaks strong enough to crack open the hardest shells. Few places in the galaxy can match Earth's diversity of predatory life forms. The general paused, and Vig could almost feel the collective intake of breath from the cadets around him. This was it, the confirmation they had all been hoping for. Earth might be a dangerous world, but humans themselves were the exception. The one species that evolved without the brutal weaponry that characterized their planet. Though, the general added, his tone shifting to something almost conversational, the humans themselves didn't inherit any of those features. Laughter spread through the crowd like a wave, starting from the front and rippling backward. Cadets chuckled, elbowed each other, made comments about how unlucky humans were to have avoided their planet's evolutionary arms race. But Vig didn't laugh. He couldn't. Because while everyone else was celebrating what humans lacked, Vig's mind was racing in a different direction entirely. If Earth was truly as dangerous as the general described, if it was home to predators that made the Nerik look tame by comparison, then how had humans survived? You didn't survive on a death world by being weak. You didn't become the dominant species on a planet full of monsters by accident. There had to be something the general wasn't saying. There had to be adaptations, advantages, weapons that weren't immediately visible to the eye. But the human just stood there, relaxed and patient, apparently unbothered by the enormous line of cadets waiting to challenge him. The enormous four-armed Vonib at the front of the line, whom Vig knew from previous training sessions as Kotip, stepped forward. Kotip was massive, even by Vonib standards. Each of his forearms thick with muscle that rippled beneath blue-gray skin. His species was known for their strength and their ability to manipulate multiple objects simultaneously with the forearms. Kotip addressed the general with the proper respect, one hand over his primary heart, while the other three remained at his sides. "General, sir, with your permission, may I challenge the human trainer?" The general's tentacles curled in what Vig recognized as a smile. "By all means, Cadet Kotip. Go ahead and do it now. No need to wait for formalities. Let's see what you're capable of." A wave of disappointment crashed through the line behind Kotip. Vig heard the reactions immediately. Frustrated voices breaking the previous excited murmur. "What, right now? But I thought we'd all get individual appointments," a voice somewhere behind Vig complained. "Damn it, if he wins, there goes our chance. I guess I'll have to try one of the others," another voice muttered, deeper and resigned. "This is unfair. How are we supposed to compete if the first person might just defeat the human and take the reward?" a third voice chimed in. Vig watched as Kotip walked toward the human with confident strides. His multiple arms swung in perfect synchronization, a display of the coordination that made Vonib such formidable opponents. When he reached the human, Kotip stopped at what he clearly considered a respectful combat distance, about 2 arm lengths away. "I am Kotip," he said, his voice formal but curt. "I will fight you now." The human's mouth curved upward in what Vig's cultural database identified as a smile, though whether it was friendly or predatory he couldn't quite tell. "Nice to meet you, Kotip. I'm Gus. I have to say, I'm pretty happy to fight someone with 4 arms. This should be interesting." There was something in the way the human, Gus, said that last sentence that made Vig's scales prickle. Not fear in the human's voice, but anticipation, maybe even excitement. As if 4 arms weren't an overwhelming advantage, but rather an interesting puzzle to solve. Kotib didn't seem to notice or care about the nuance. He immediately dropped into his combat stance, all 4 arms rising into defensive positions that covered multiple angles of attack simultaneously. The general raised one tentacle, held it for a moment to ensure both combatants were ready, then dropped it sharply. Kotip attacked first, naturally. His species' combat doctrine emphasized using numerical advantage to overwhelm opponents before they could establish a rhythm. 2 of his arms shot forward in synchronized jabs, aimed at Gus's head and torso, while a 3rd arm came from below in an uppercut trajectory, and then the 4th positioned to block any counterattack. Gus dodged, but it wasn't just a simple sidestep or duck. The human moved with his hands clasped behind his back, as if showing off, as if saying that even without using his arms, Kotip's 4-armed assault was no real threat. Gus's torso twisted, his feet pivoted, and suddenly he was 3 inches to the left of where all 4 of Kotip's strikes had been aimed. The Vonib's initial attempts hit nothing but air. Vig saw Kotip's eyes widen. The disrespect of that dodge, the casual dismissal of what should have been an overwhelming opening attack, triggered something primal in the Vonib. Kotick went berserk. He threw everything at the human. Straight punches, hooks, uppercuts from all 4 arms in combinations that should have been impossible to avoid. But Gus just kept moving. He dodged with minimal effort, his body flowing like water around stone. The pattern continued for what felt like an eternity. Then, apparently, Gus decided he had had enough. Kotip threw another combination. 4 fists coming from 4 different angles in perfect Vonib synchronization. But this time, instead of dodging away, Gus stepped forward and slightly to the side, entering Kotip's guard in a way that seemed suicidal, but somehow put him in a position where none of the 4 strikes could reach him. The human's hands finally came out from behind his back. What happened next was almost too fast for Vig to follow. Gus's right arm moved in a tight arc, and his fist connected with Kotip's jaw. The impact wasn't flashy. There was no dramatic wind-up, just a short, perfectly placed strike that transferred all of Gus's momentum into Kotip's skull. Kotip's eyes rolled back. His massive body, which outweighed the human by at least 50%, crumpled to the platform floor like a puppet with its strings cut. He was unconscious before he finished falling. Silence descended on the assembly hall. Even the general's tentacles had stopped their chaotic movement, freezing mid-writhe, as if surprised by the suddenness of the conclusion. Then the silence broke as 2 cadets near Vig began whispering to each other. "Well, that was impressive," the first one said, trying to sound nonchalant but not quite succeeding. "But Kotip got too aggressive, lost his discipline. I wouldn't make that mistake." "Exactly," the second agreed. "The human's fast, sure, but he's small. One good hit and it's over. I just need to be smart about it, not charge in like a Vonib berserker." Vig barely heard them. His mind was working through what he had just witnessed, analyzing it from every angle. The general had set them up. This was a trap, a lesson disguised as an opportunity. It had to be. The way the general had presented the choice, the way he had described the humans' lack of natural weapons, the mockery in his voice when they all chose Gus. It was all calculated to lead them into exactly this situation. The human wasn't defenseless. He was just armed in ways that weren't immediately obvious. Speed, certainly. That much was clear from the dodging. But also timing, and apparently the ability to generate devastating force from short, compact movements. Those were skills, trained abilities, but they had to be supported by some kind of physical capability that humans possessed. Otherwise, training alone couldn't have produced that knockout punch. Vig felt a wave of relief wash over him that he had positioned himself in the middle of the line rather than rushing to the front. He would have more time to observe, to understand what he was really dealing with, before making any decisions about whether to proceed with his own challenge. Medical personnel were already rushing onto the platform to attend to Kotip. The Vonib was still unconscious, his breathing steady, but his body completely unresponsive. The next cadet in line stepped forward without waiting for an invitation. This one was roughly the same height as Gus, maybe slightly taller, and Vig didn't immediately recognize the species. What he could see was that everything about this being screamed speed. The body was streamlined, aerodynamic even, with smooth contours that suggested minimal air resistance. The legs were long and thin, built for rapid movement rather than power. The eyes moved constantly, darting from side to side with a nervous energy that suggested a predatory instinct to track movement. This cadet didn't bother with introductions. The moment the general signaled the start, it exploded into motion. Where Kotip had been powerful and aggressive, this cadet was a blur. It closed the distance to Gus in a fraction of a second and immediately launched into a flurry of rapid strikes. The cadet's strategy was clear: overwhelmed with speed, hit so many times that eventually something had to land. But Gus didn't dodge this time. He couldn't, Vig realized. The attacks were coming too fast, from too many angles, to simply avoid them all. Instead, the human did something different. His arms came up in tight movements, and he began intercepting the strikes directly. A block here, a parry there, each movement minimal. Where he had fought Kotip with evasion, he was fighting this opponent with direct interception. And there was something else. Gus's entire fighting style had changed. Against Kotip, he had been almost playful, showing off with his hands behind his back. Against this speed-focused opponent, he was all business. His stance was different, more squared up. His weight more evenly distributed. He was matching his approach to his opponent, adapting in real time. The speedy cadet tried to change tactics, attempted to circle around Gus to attack from behind, but the human pivoted with a smoothness that suggested either extensive training or an innate spatial awareness that was almost uncanny. Then Gus saw his opening. Using the cadet's own momentum against him, Gus pulled forward while simultaneously stepping to the side. The punch caught the cadet in the jaw. His eyes went wide, mouth opened in a silent gasp, and then he too collapsed, unconscious before his body hit the platform. The medical team hadn't even finished loading Kotip onto the stretcher yet. Now they had a second patient to attend to. Vig watched as the pattern repeated itself again and again. The third challenger was a being with thick, armor-like scales and a powerful build. This one lasted longer than the first two, using their natural armor to absorb some of Gus's strikes and trying to wear the human down through attrition. The fourth challenger was a reptilian being with a long, powerful tail that they used like a whip, keeping Gus at a distance while looking for an opening to close in with their claws. Gus simply timed the tail swings, caught the appendage mid-strike, and used it to pull the reptilian off balance before throwing them clear of the platform. A furred creature came next, and soon it took a knee to the belly that left it doubled over, vomiting on the platform. By the time the 8th, 9th, and 10th challengers had fallen, Vig had lost count of exactly how many cadets had tried and failed. The fights were starting to blur together in his mind, and more importantly, Gus didn't seem to be tiring in any significant way. Then suddenly, Vig was at the front of the line, but his body remained motionless. His legs, which had carried him this far, suddenly felt like they were made of stone. His mind raced through everything he had observed, every technique Gus had used, every weakness he might exploit. And yet, Vig's body refused to move forward. "Hey, come on!" a voice called from behind him, impatient and edged with frustration. "Move it already!" "Yeah," another voice agreed, this one trying to sound confident and failing. "The human must be getting tired by now. This might actually be our chance. Don't waste it." Vig stared at all the cadets who had tried before him, and once more his legs refused to move. The general's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Cadet Vig, do you wish to challenge the human trainer?" Vig's eyes slowly tracked up to meet the general's gaze. Those alien eyes looked back at him with an expression Vig couldn't quite read. Not judgment exactly, not disappointment, something else. Expectation, perhaps, or maybe just curiosity. Vig's mouth moved before his brain fully formulated the words. "Nah," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I'm good." He expected immediate consequences, a reprimand maybe, or dismissal for cowardice. But instead, the general laughed. "Excellent!" the general exclaimed. "And tell me, Cadet Vig, do you wish to challenge the other Death Worlders? Perhaps the Nerik or the Zevol would be more to your liking." Vig glanced over at the other two trainers and shook his head. "Nah," he repeated, his voice neutral. "I'm good." The general burst out laughing again, louder this time, his whole body shaking with mirth. His tentacles writhed so chaotically that they tangled with each other, and he had to take a moment to straighten them out before he could speak. When he finally controlled himself, he raised his voice to address the entire assembly. "It took long enough," the general announced, his tone still heavy with amusement, "to find a smart one." Vig felt confusion wash over him like a wave. He looked around, trying to understand what was happening, why his refusal to fight was being celebrated rather than punished. The other cadets seemed equally bewildered, many of them looking at each other with questions evident in their various expressions and body languages. But the general was already explaining, his voice taking on the authoritative tone of an instructor delivering a crucial lesson. "Today's challenge," he began, "was never supposed to be won. I never expected any of you to actually defeat trained Death World warriors. These three individuals," he gestured to Gus, the Nerik, and the Zevol, "have been fighting and training since before most of you could walk, fly, slither, or however your species achieves locomotion. They have spent decades honing their skills, learning their crafts, and surviving in environments that would kill the average galactic citizen in minutes." The general paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "The lesson I wanted to teach you today is this. Never judge a predator by appearance alone. Not by the number of claws they possess, not by the length of their fangs, not by the presence or lack of obvious natural weapons. Some of the most dangerous beings in the galaxy don't look dangerous at all, and that's precisely what makes them so effective." He gestured toward Gus specifically. "Humans are a perfect example. Look at them. Soft skin, no claws, no fangs, no armor. But what you cannot see from the outside are the traits that allowed them to dominate one of the most hostile planets ever discovered. Let me educate you about human endurance. A human can run for hours, days even, in pursuit of prey. On Earth, humans literally hunted animals to death by following them until the prey collapsed from exhaustion. That's persistence predation, and humans are among the galaxies best at it. The general was warming to his topic now, his tentacles gesturing to emphasize his points. Human muscles are incredibly dense compared to their body mass. That's a result of evolving in high gravity. What looks like a soft, weak frame is actually packed with muscle tissue that can generate enormous force. That's why Kotip, who outweighed Gus by 50 kilograms, went down with a single punch. Density and leverage combined with technique. And let's talk about human hands, the general continued. You look at them and see no claws, nothing dangerous. But those hands can grip with enough force to crush bones. Humans might not have natural weapons, but they're extraordinarily good at making and using artificial ones. Vig listened, absorbing every word, feeling both validated in his decision and foolish for not seeing it sooner. Of course, humans had advantages. They had to. But those advantages weren't obvious, weren't written on the surface of their bodies for everyone to see. They were hidden, internal, requiring knowledge and observation to detect. But beyond the physical traits, the general said, there are other lessons you should have learned today. Lesson 1. Know your enemy. Not just their species or their basic capabilities, but their actual skills, their training, their experience. Many of you charged forward to challenge Gus without even attempting to gather information about what you were facing. Lesson 2. Know your own strengths and limitations. Several of you tried to use fighting styles that played directly into the human strengths rather than exploiting any advantages you might have. Lesson 3, and here the general pointed at the fallen cadets. Learn from the mistakes of others. Cadet Vig here demonstrated this principle perfectly. He stood in line. He watched. He analyzed. And he came to the correct conclusion. This was not a fight he could win. The general's gaze swept across the assembly. Some of you might be thinking that Cadet Vig gave up, that he showed cowardice by refusing to fight. But I would argue the opposite. It takes more courage to admit you're outmatched than to throw yourself into a hopeless battle. It takes more wisdom to avoid unnecessary conflict than to seek it out. These are the qualities we need in the Galactic Army, not blind aggression and false confidence. Vig felt a warmth spread through his chest, something like pride mixed with relief. He had made the right choice, even if it hadn't felt like it at the time. His instincts, his analysis, his willingness to learn from observation rather than painful experience, all of it had been correct. Now, the general said, his tone becoming more conversational, let me tell you a bit more about Earth and humanity, since you've all demonstrated a rather alarming lack of knowledge about one of the Federation's newest member species. Earth is a Type 13 death world, which means it ranks in the top 10% of most hostile planets supporting intelligent life. The gravity is 1.5 times galactic standard. The atmosphere has a higher oxygen content than most civilized worlds, which supports more energetic life forms and makes everything burn hotter and faster. The general's tentacles spread wide, emphasizing the scope of what he was describing. And yet, humans live there. They climbed to the top of their planetary food chain without claws, without fangs, without venom or armor. So, remember this day, the general concluded, his voice taking on a harder edge. Remember the lesson that your injured classmates learned the painful way. Never underestimate an opponent based on appearance. Never assume that lack of obvious weapons means lack of danger. And always gather intelligence before engaging in conflict. These lessons could save your lives someday. The assembly hall was completely silent now. every cadet hanging on the general's words. The weight of the lesson finally settling in. Vig saw understanding dawning on faces around him, saw the shift from confusion to comprehension. They got it now. They understood what the day had really been about. "Now," the general said, his tone brightening considerably, "I know this hasn't been the day any of you expected when you woke up this morning. You came here hoping for immediate promotions, for glory, for an easy path to advancement. Instead, you got a harsh lesson delivered by skilled warriors. So, here's what I'm going to do." The general's tentacles curled in what Vig now recognized as a warm, genuine smile. "You might not have won any promotions today, but at today's lunch, we're going to serve several foods from Earth as a reward for your, let's call it, participation. The humans have been kind enough to share some of their cuisine with us, and I think you'll find it quite interesting. We'll have something called pizza, which is a flatbread with various toppings. We'll have hamburgers, which are ground meat served on a bun with various condiments. We'll have tacos, which are, well, you'll see." The general paused for dramatic effect. "But most importantly, we'll have a very peculiar dessert that I am absolutely certain you will love. It's called cotton candy. So, head to the dining facility, enjoy your Earth food, think about what you learned today." As the general finished speaking, the assembly began to break up. Cadets started moving toward the exits, some limping, others deep in conversation about everything that had happened. Vig remained where he was for a moment, watching as Gus finally stepped down from the platform. The human walked over to some of the conscious cadets he had fought, offering his hand in what Vig recognized from his cultural database as a gesture of respect and no hard feelings. Most of them took it, shaking the human's hand with varying degrees of enthusiasm and embarrassment. Then Gus looked over at Vig and caught his eye. The human walked over, that slight smile still playing at his lips. "Good call back there," Gus said, his voice pitched for only Vig to hear. "Takes guts to walk away from a fight, especially with everyone watching. You're smarter than most." "Thanks," Vig managed, not quite sure what else to say. You're pretty impressive yourself." Gus chuckled. "I've had a lot of practice, and between you and me," he leaned in conspiratorially, "I was getting pretty tired toward the end there. If you had fought me, you might have had a better chance than you think. But don't tell the general I said that." Vig felt his scales prickle again, but this time with something like appreciation. The human was being kind, offering a bit of dignity even in the wake of Vig's refusal to fight. "Your secret's safe with me," Vig replied. As Gus walked away, Vig finally turned toward the exit. He was hungry, he realized, and the thought of trying Earth food was suddenly very appealing. All in all, Vig thought as he headed toward the dining facility, it had been a pretty good day. Not the day he had expected, not the day he had hoped for when he woke up that morning, but a good day nonetheless. And if cotton candy was even half as good as the general claimed, it might even turn into a great day.